They didn't even ask for her name. 2 officers, 1 cruiser. Flashing lights bouncing off the side of a black Lexus sedan parked just a few feet off the shoulder of I-295 South. The sun was starting to drop behind the tree line, but there was still plenty of daylight left to see what was happening, especially for the drivers who began slowing down, unsure of what exactly they were witnessing. The taller of the 2 officers, badge number clearly visible but unreadable from a distance, had his hand on his holster the moment he stepped out of the car. The other, younger, was already halfway to the driver's side window before the car had even come to a full stop. Inside sat a black woman, calm, hands already resting on the steering wheel. No signs of panic, no sudden movements, just controlled breathing and eyes that followed every movement around her like she'd been here before, but never quite like this. "Step out of the vehicle," the tall one barked. "May I ask why I'm being out? Now." She blinked once, slowly, then unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. By the time her feet touched the pavement, the younger officer had already reached for her wrist. No name, no reason, just cuffs. Her coat was still buttoned. The thin gold insignia on her chest, the one partially covered by the wool collar, went unnoticed, and that was their first mistake. She didn't fight, didn't pull away, didn't even flinch when her hands were forced behind her back with a little more pressure than necessary. She just turned her head, just enough to look at the older officer in the eye, and said, in a voice so clear, so unwavering, it didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like a fact. "You're making the biggest mistake of your careers." One driver slowed down enough to catch the moment on their phone. Another honked in protest, but the officers were too deep into the performance to back down now. The woman, mid-30s, tall, composed, was walked to the back of the cruiser. No one asked for ID, no one checked the plates, and no one noticed that the woman, while being escorted, shifted slightly, just enough to reach the inside pocket of her coat with her free fingers. A single vibration, then a dial tone. She pressed one button, held it up to her cheek, and when a voice on the other end answered, she whispered just 3 words. Code red, me. Then let the phone fall back into her pocket as the handcuffs clicked. The taller officer chuckled under his breath. "You people always think someone's coming to save you." She didn't answer. She just looked forward, because she wasn't waiting for help. She'd already called it. The cruiser door slammed shut behind her, and the cage clicked into place. Aisha Monroe leaned back against the hard plastic seat, wrists bound in cold steel, her breathing steady, almost unnaturally so. The younger cop glanced back at her in the rearview mirror, chewing the inside of his lip like he was trying to figure out if she was just incredibly calm or holding something. He chose wrong. "So where were you headed in such a hurry, ma'am?" he asked. No response. "Car's registered to a government name," the older officer muttered as he slid into the driver's seat. "Probably some rental. Feds use those sometimes, but they don't usually drive alone." He turned toward her, his tone suddenly laced with suspicion. "You military?" Still, she said nothing. The silence wasn't defiance, it was calculation. Because Aisha wasn't worried about what came next. She was timing it. 7 minutes since the call. She knew how long it would take. She'd read the protocol manual they never knew existed. The cruiser pulled away from the roadside like nothing had happened. But behind them, in a black SUV idling near the shoulder, a man in a charcoal suit quietly lowered his binoculars and tapped once on his earpiece. "Confirm code red. Asset acquired. Mishandled by local units. Notify JSOC command." He pulled back onto the road. No lights, no sirens, just shadow. Back inside the cruiser, the younger officer chuckled nervously. "What's your name again?" Still nothing. He turned to the older one. "She could be CIA. You think she's one of those deep cover people?" "If she was, she'd already be screaming for her lawyer," the senior officer replied. That was the second mistake, because Aisha Monroe didn't scream. She didn't need to. She'd been trained to survive interrogation, to hold posture under pressure, to give nothing until the room gave up first. They didn't know her name, her rank, her record. They didn't know she'd been embedded in war zones while they wrote parking tickets. They didn't know she'd held a top-level security clearance for longer than they'd been cops. They didn't know she wasn't just in uniform. She was the system they thought they worked for. 11 minutes since the call. Aisha shifted slightly in the seat. The steel of the cuffs was beginning to bite into her wrists. But she didn't complain. She counted the seconds, because she knew the moment was coming. When they'd stop asking questions and start realizing the answers were already en route. The phone call didn't go to 911. It bypassed civilian towers, rerouted through encrypted military nodes, and landed exactly where she knew it would. At the Pentagon, in a narrow glass office overlooking a line of flagpoles, a secure red-line phone blinked once. Only once. Colonel Marla Kessler was mid-sentence in a budget meeting when she saw it. She stopped talking, stood up, and walked out. 2 minutes later, she was locked inside her operations room with a tablet in hand, scanning a name that hadn't come up in over a year. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Monroe, Strategic Risk Analyst, Tier 3 Clearance, Active Duty, DOD Protected Asset. Last ping, I-295 southbound. Arrest status, confirmed. Local unit involved, civilian precinct. 2 patrol officers. Kessler's mouth went dry. She didn't say a word, just tapped the screen, issuing a silent chain of protocols. Her command staff didn't ask questions, they just moved. 17 miles away, the patrol car kept cruising like nothing had happened. The radio crackled with standard dispatch noise. The officers were planning their next move, booking her under refusal to cooperate. They still hadn't asked for ID, because deep down, they didn't think they needed to. She was a black woman in an expensive car, quiet but unmoving. To them, that was enough. What if she's like a contractor? The younger officer mumbled. I mean, maybe we should just run her plates again. The senior officer scoffed. She didn't even give a name. If she's important, we'd already know. This isn't Quantico. In the back seat, Aisha closed her eyes. Not to sleep, not to surrender, but to calculate. She was trained to respond under hostile capture. But this wasn't hostile territory. This was home, and that made it worse. Exactly 18 minutes after the call was placed, a black SUV with Department of Defense plates turned onto the highway ramp and began accelerating. Fast, inside, a 4-person rapid liaison team reviewed briefing files on a tablet, satellite footage, live traffic feeds, digital overlays of the patrol route. The driver didn't speak, just tapped the steering wheel once as if to say, they don't know who they touched. Back in the patrol car, Aisha opened her eyes. She shifted slightly in her seat, just enough to look into the rearview mirror and lock eyes with the younger officer again. This time, she spoke. You're running out of time. The officer blinked. What did you just... But before he could finish, the radio crackled. Then again. Unit 27, do you copy? Unit 27, be advised. Supervisor en route to your location. Hold position immediately. The senior officer grabbed the receiver. Copy. Subject in custody. Standard traffic detention. Negative. The dispatcher cut in. Hold your position. Do not proceed to booking. This is now a department-level situation. The cruiser slowed. The air inside thickened. Aisha didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just leaned her head back against the seat and waited for the truth to arrive. They heard it before they saw it. The hum of the engine wasn't like a regular patrol car. It was lower, heavier, like something that didn't just arrive. It descended. The cruiser was pulled over near a gas station now. The officers had stepped out, pacing, fidgeting, trying to look composed while quietly panicking. The senior officer radioed in again, voice tight. Can we get clarification on who's en route? Negative, the dispatcher replied. You'll be briefed on site. Hold position. That phrase again. Hold position. When the SUV pulled up, it didn't flash lights, it didn't honk. It just glided to a stop behind the cruiser like a shadow that had finally caught up. The doors opened in sync. First out, A woman in a crisp gray suit with a defense ID lanyard swinging against her chest. Second, a uniformed Navy officer with gold trim and a tablet already in hand. Last, a civilian man, no visible rank, but everyone moved when he moved. The senior officer walked over, trying to square his shoulders. "Afternoon. This about our suspect?" The woman in the suit didn't answer. She walked right past him to the back of the cruiser, paused, then knocked once on the window. Aisha lifted her head. Their eyes met. "Ma'am, we're here. Step out when ready." The younger officer's mouth fell open. "Wait, what? Who is she?" The man with the tablet answered without looking up. "Lieutenant Commander Aisha Monroe, Department of Defense. Active clearance. Level 3 protocol holder. Protected national security asset." He finally looked up. "And based on your report, you handcuffed her without ID verification, without search consent, and without probable cause." The silence was nuclear. Aisha stepped out slowly. She didn't speak. The woman in the gray suit unlocked the cuffs herself, not looking at the officers even once. Aisha rubbed her wrists once, then looked directly at the older cop. "You didn't even ask for my name," the senior officer stammered. "Ma'am, we had reason to believe the vehicle." "Save it," the Navy officer cut in. "Everything you've said is on body cam. Everything you didn't say is already worse." He turned to the civilian man. "Full internal review?" The man nodded, effective immediately. Drivers on the highway were slowing down. People were filming. Aisha didn't perform, didn't wave, didn't posture. She just walked toward the SUV, and before she stepped in, she looked over her shoulder once. "You didn't kneel for my title. You're scrambling now because of what it means." She stepped inside. The door closed, and the officers were left standing on the side of the road, with a cruiser, a uniform, and the sudden realization that none of it had ever made them untouchable. It started with a single upload, a grainy vertical video, 38 seconds long, posted by a college student sitting in the passenger seat of his friend's car, stuck in traffic on I-295. The caption read, "Cops cuffed a black woman on the side of the road. She said one sentence, and 15 minutes later a black SUV showed up. Then they all shut up." That was all it took. Within an hour, the video had 1.3 million views on X. By morning, it had climbed to 5 million across platforms, with hashtags like, "Who is she?" "Code Red Call." "Not your average traffic stop." People began to slow the video down, frame by frame. Some noticed the handcuffs. Others noticed the calmness. But what sent the internet into overdrive was that one line. "You're making the biggest mistake of your careers." It was clipped, captioned, set to music, turned into a meme, a battle cry, a sermon. Because for millions of black women watching that clip, she didn't just speak to 2 cops. She spoke to every room that ever underestimated them. The department didn't respond. Not at first. Then came the trickle. "We're reviewing body cam footage. We take officer conduct seriously. The individual involved has since been identified." But they never used her name, never said Lieutenant Commander, never said, "We were wrong," and the silence grew louder. Local news tried to stay neutral. National news didn't bother. By the second day, cable anchors were saying what everyone else already knew. This isn't about a traffic stop. It's about why some people can wear the uniform and still be seen as a threat, and why others can misuse it and still be seen as the law. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the internal mood had shifted. Phones weren't ringing. They were burning. Officers were deleting tweets. One lieutenant called in sick and didn't come back. And in a locked conference room, the chief was reviewing the body cam footage on loop, sweating through his collar while the city attorney took notes. But Aisha? She didn't say a word. She didn't post, didn't go live, didn't grant interviews, because she knew this wasn't her moment. It was their moment to explain what they had done and why it took a black woman in uniform for the world to finally look. The department's press release came 48 hours too late. Dry language, no names, no apology. Just the usual. Under review, standard protocol, internal procedures. But the world wasn't interested in procedure anymore. They had the footage, they had the voice, and more importantly, they had questions. It didn't take long for people to start digging. By day 3, anonymous Reddit users and digital watchdogs had already pieced together the officers' past interactions. Old body cam clips resurfaced, traffic stops with no citations. Routine checks that always involved young black men or women, a pattern so obvious it didn't require confirmation. It demanded accountability. One clip from 6 months earlier showed the same older officer shouting at a 19-year-old girl outside a convenience store. "You fit the description. Don't make this worse than it has to be." No arrest, no paperwork, no apology, just silence, until now. Meanwhile, the video of Aisha Monroe had become more than viral. It had become symbolic. News segments started calling her the woman in silence. Editorials asked, how much power does it take to say nothing and still dismantle everything? Young women were posting videos with captions like, "I walk different now because of her." Inside the precinct, the shift was real. Supervisors avoided eye contact. Internal affairs agents were randomly re-interviewing patrol staff, and both officers from the incident were pulled from active duty pending investigation, though the department didn't announce it publicly. The younger one deactivated all social media. The older one hired a lawyer, because they finally realized this wasn't going away. And yet through all of this, Aisha still hadn't spoken. No interview, no appearance, no hashtags. She went back to her base, resumed her work, and issued a single-line statement through her commanding officer. "My silence was not compliance. It was the loudest thing I could give you." By the end of the week, they knew her name. Town's Commander Aisha Monroe, U.S. Navy. 13 years of service, strategic operations, multiple citations for leadership under pressure, top-level clearance. But those details didn't make her go viral. What made her a movement was how little she said while the entire world finally listened. People began recognizing her. At gas stations, on base, even inside grocery stores. Strangers would stare for a moment longer. Some approached gently. One teenage girl, maybe 16, walked up in a cafe line and whispered, "You didn't even yell. You didn't even have to, thank you." Aisha nodded. But when she got back to her car that day, she didn't drive right away. She just sat there, because all of it, the headlines, the hashtags, the praise, it felt hollow. She hadn't planned to go quiet to be powerful. She went quiet because she'd been trained to stay composed under fire. She didn't freeze. She calculated, because in her world, one wrong word could cost more than pride. It could cost lives. Back at the precinct, 2 resignations were submitted. An internal memo leaked. The department had launched what they called a cultural practices review. No one believed it would change much, but they couldn't ignore the pressure anymore. Not because a woman screamed, but because she didn't. And in that silence, every institution that claimed to stand for justice was now being asked what exactly they stood for when no one was watching. Aisha returned to work. She showed up to her briefings, completed reports, laughed with the same small group of colleagues who knew her before she was trending. But something had shifted. Not just in the world, in her. She wasn't trying to be a symbol, but now she had to decide what to do with the attention, because the world wanted a quote, a speech, a viral moment to carry into the next outrage. But Aisha didn't want noise. She wanted consequence. They invited her to speak at a city forum, civilian leaders, police brass, activists, the usual faces who only show up once damage control turns into optics. She didn't accept right away. 3 invitations came, then 4. She said no to all of them. But on the 5th, when she saw that the audience list included cadets, not commanders, not chiefs, but new recruits, she said yes, not because she wanted to be applauded, but because she knew. You don't change a system by yelling at the top. You start by whispering where the next generation listens. The room was silent when she walked in. No military dress uniform, no podium theatrics. Just a plain black blazer, natural hair tied back, and a binder tucked under one arm. She didn't carry authority. She was authority, without needing to raise her voice. She stood, looked out, and began. You already know my name. What matters more is that you understand why I never said it the day they stopped me. I wasn't scared. I wasn't confused. I wasn't powerless. I was trained not to escalate. I was trained not to provoke. I was trained to survive people who don't see my uniform unless I'm in combat. And sometimes, not even then. You could hear shoes shifting across carpet, throats clearing. No one dared interrupt. What scared me most wasn't the cuffs. It wasn't the guns. It was how natural it all felt to them. Like this wasn't the first time they grabbed someone without asking, and like it wouldn't be the last. I made one phone call, and the system snapped awake. But if I didn't wear this rank, if I didn't have that clearance, would you even be listening now? A pause. She looked directly at the cadets. This isn't a speech to make you feel bad. It's a warning. If your badge only works when no one's recording, it's not a badge, it's a mask. She closed the binder. No applause. Just silence, until someone in the back stood. Then another. Then the room, not clapping, just standing, because they knew. She didn't speak to be celebrated. She spoke because someone had to. The clip of her speech wasn't supposed to go public. There were no press cameras, no official recording, just a quiet moment in a government building, but one cadet in the back had recorded it on their phone. And 2 days later, with shaking fingers and no caption, they posted it. She told us the truth. I'm not letting them bury it. The clip exploded, but not like a scandal, like a mirror. It didn't trend like a meme. It didn't blow up with outrage. It sat in people's bones, shared in group chats, sent in inboxes between officers and rookies, reposted by veterans who had never been pulled over and said, I would have never lasted a day in her skin. Within a week, 3 police academies added the video to their ethics module. Then 10. Then the Federal Training Center in Georgia made it part of mandatory racial profiling curriculum. One captain was quoted anonymously saying, I've had men yell at me in hearings, scream at me in protests, but one woman looked me in the eye and told me the truth without flinching. And I felt it. Aisha never watched the clip. She never reposted it, never gave permission. She didn't need to, because this wasn't her campaign. It was her testimony. She received letters, emails, even flowers, sometimes anonymously left on her windshield. One note read, You gave my daughter language for something she couldn't name before. You gave her herself. She never wrote back. She didn't have to. Because for the first time in her life, the silence around her wasn't isolation. It was respect. The official statement came on a Thursday. Stiff language, uncharacteristically humble. For the first time in years, the Metro Police Department used the words, "We were wrong." They acknowledged mishandling, admitted profiling, cited the names of both officers involved, promised a cultural restructuring effort, but most shockingly, they named her. To Lieutenant Commander Aisha Monroe, we apologize for failing to recognize your identity, your dignity, and your service. No citizen should ever have to invoke power to be seen as human. It made headlines. CNN, BBC, even military forums lit up with debate and praise. The apology was covered more than most resignations, because apologies this public, this direct, don't happen unless something broke, and something had. But Aisha didn't respond with applause. She didn't thank them, didn't appear on air, didn't give a counter-statement. Instead, she accepted an invitation from a local high school, one that had invited her long before the apology ever came. She walked into an auditorium of 200 students, all quiet, all watching her like she had something they'd never been given before, proof that the world could be forced to see them. She stood at the front with no speech prepared, just one sentence on a note card in her palm. She raised her eyes and read it aloud. When people tell you to shrink to survive, remind them that silence is not submission. It is sometimes just preparation. The students didn't cheer. They stood, all of them. Some wiped tears, some just stared. But in that room, no one walked out, unchanged. Aisha returned home that evening to no cameras, no statements, no ceremonies. But she knew something had shifted. Not just in the department, not just in her city. In the story this country tells itself about who gets to be heard. It happened 2 months later. Different city, different officers, different woman. But something about it felt familiar. Right down to the slow, cautious stop on the side of the highway, the 2 patrol cars, the cold tension in the air as the driver kept her hands at 10 and 2. Her name was Danielle Hayes. She wasn't a lieutenant. She wasn't military. She was a school nurse headed home after a double shift, tired, quiet, and already rehearsing the words she might need to stay safe. But this time, the officer approached slowly, hands visible, body camera already recording. "Good evening, ma'am. Just wanted to let you know we had a report about a taillight flickering. May I see your license and registration when you're ready?" No barking, no flashlight in the face, no questions about where you're coming from. Just calm. Danielle's fingers still trembled. Old habits don't die that fast. But when she passed over her license, the officer took it, glanced at it, then paused. "You're a nurse?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for what you do." He handed it back. "Have a safe night, and thank you again." She sat there for a full minute after he walked away. Not because she was confused, because she didn't expect it to go that way, because it never had, because for the first time, she felt like her job, her dignity, her humanity, didn't need to be proven. And later that night, she sent a quiet message to the one person she never expected to hear back from. "You didn't know me, but you made something safer without even being in the car. That matters. I just wanted to say thank you, Aisha Monroe." The world moved on, the way it always does. News cycles shifted, hashtags faded. The next outrage replaced the last. But somewhere beneath the noise, her name stayed. Not trending, not loud, just present. In police academies, her video became more than a lesson. It became a test. Cadets were shown the clip and asked not just, "What went wrong?" but, "What would you have done differently?" One recruit answered, "I would have seen her." That's where it starts, right? Not reacting, just seeing. In a Pentagon hallway, her name was added, quietly, formally, to a list of active service members who had impacted domestic interagency reform. A first. Not for combat, not for valor, but for refusing to let a broken system stay comfortable. And Aisha, she stayed in service. No promotion tour, no memoir, no foundation bearing her name. She just kept showing up. Every morning, every briefing, every encounter with someone who assumed nothing ever changes. And when a young officer in training once asked her during a quiet lunch, "Why didn't you say more? You could have taken them all down." She took a sip of her coffee and said, "Because if I burned it all down, they'd just rebuild it without me. But if I walked through the fire and stood still, they'd have to build around me." 1 year later, she returned to that same city. No cameras, no news, just a visit to the school where that high school auditorium once fell silent at her words. They'd hung a small plaque near the stage. It read, "Silence is not submission. It's sometimes just preparation." Lieutenant Commander Aisha Monroe, she ran her fingers along the edge, closed her eyes, and let herself feel it. Not victory, but movement. Because she didn't come to win. She came to interrupt. And if this story left something in you, a thought, a question, a reflection, ask yourself this: how many voices have we trained ourselves not to hear, just because they refuse to scream? Because sometimes the revolution doesn't start with a march. It starts with someone refusing to flinch. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not for the algorithm, but because the silence around us doesn't break itself.